The call at 2 Amit was 2 a.m. in Palo Alto when Sundar Pichai's phone started buzzing on the wooden nightstand. At first, he ignored it. The house was quiet. The wind outside rattled the window. He was half asleep, lost in some dream of his boyhood. In Chennai, when the buzzing came again, louder this time, insistent, almost desperate, he reached over grudgingly and glanced at the screen. The name made his heart stop. Anita, his ex-wife. He hadn't spoken to Anita in over 12 years. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second. In those few seconds, 1,000 memories crashed over him. The day they first met at the Indian Institute of Technology. How she used to smile at him from the back of the classroom, the arguments, the quiet dinners, and finally the day she walked away without looking back. He answered. "Hello?" he said. His voice dried up. There was silence for a moment. Then he heard it, soft, muffled crying on the other end. "Sundar," she whispered. I didn't know who else to call. He sat up now, fully awake, the blankets falling to the floor. The crying on the other end grew louder, and there was something in her voice he didn't recognize. Fear. "Anita, what's wrong?" He asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Please," she said. "Please just come. I can't explain it over the phone." He could hear the sound of a door slamming somewhere near her, then more crying, and then the line went dead for a long minute. Sundar sat there in the dark, staring at the phone. He was CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, a man who had spoken before presidents and kings, who had solved impossible problems and faced down angry investors. But his hands were shaking. He got dressed quickly, throwing on a sweater and jeans. As he slipped on his shoes, his mind kept racing. She had sounded broken. She had never sounded like that before. He thought of calling someone, maybe the police, but something inside him told him no. She had called him, and only him. He couldn't betray that trust dot outside. The air was cold and sharp. He climbed into his car and started driving through the empty streets, past the sleeping houses and the quiet trees dot as he drove. His mind wandered back to their last days together. The fights, yes, but also the kindness. How she had believed in him back when no one else did, when he was just a shy engineer with big dreams and no confidence. How she would leave notes in his lunchbox telling him not to give up. Why now? Why after so many years? He reached her street just as the sun was starting to lighten the edges of the sky. Her apartment building looked quiet. Too quiet, he climbed the stairs two at a time and knocked on her door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Anita?" "It's me. Open the door." Nothing. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn. There were papers scattered on the floor, and a chair tipped over. The air smelled faintly of something metallic. "Anita?" He called out, his voice echoing. Then he heard it, a soft sob coming from the bedroom. He walked to the bedroom and pushed the door open slowly. There she was, sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her hair a mess, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was holding something in her hand, a crumpled photograph. When she looked up at him, her eyes were full of pain and something else, something he couldn't quite name. You came," she whispered. "Of course," he said gently. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed him the photograph. His hands trembled as he took it and unfolded it. It was a picture of the two of them from years ago, standing on a beach in Chennai, smiling at the camera. But someone had scribbled across it in red ink. "You can't hide." His breath caught in his throat. "Who did this?" he asked. She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of her sweater. "They said, if I don't give it to them, they'll hurt me. Give it to them." She shook her head, more tears falling. "I can't tell you, not yet." "Anita," he said, kneeling in front of her. "Whatever this is, we'll fix it. Together." For the first time, she looked him in the eyes, and in that moment, he saw the girl he had once loved. And something inside him cracked out, then suddenly there was a loud crash from the living room. The sound of glass shattering. He stood up quickly. his heart pounding. "Stay here," he whispered. He stepped out of the bedroom, his eyes scanning the dark apartment. There was a shadow moving by the window. Someone was there. "Who's there?" He called out, but no one answered. Instead, the shadow moved fast, and before he could react, the front door slammed shut. He rushed to the window and caught a glimpse of a figure in a black hoodie disappearing into the alley below Dot when he turned back to the bedroom. Anita was standing now, her face pale. "They know you're here," she said softly. "And now, they'll come for you too." He stood there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her words sink in Dot in that moment. Sundar Pichai, the man who thought he had left his past behind, realized he had just stepped into something far bigger and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Dot and outside. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of sirens growing closer. Asterisk, the stranger in the alley, the sirens grew louder. And for a moment, Sundar stood frozen in the middle of Anita's darkened apartment. The faint red and blue lights flashing through the curtains like a warning. The air felt heavier now, charged with fear and confusion. He turned toward Anita, and in that dim light, he saw how she was gripping the edge of the wall, as if trying to keep herself from collapsing. Her lips trembled when she spoke. "You should go," she whispered. "They'll hurt you if they see you here. This has nothing to do with you." But Sundar couldn't move. Something in him refused to leave her alone. Not like this, not when she was so clearly in danger. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that it sounded softer, but firmer too. "Anita," he said, "you called me. You didn't call anyone else, so don't tell me it has nothing to do with me. Tell me what's going on, please." Her eyes darted toward the window, toward the alley outside where the figure in the black hoodie had vanished moments earlier. Then she looked back at him, her breath catching in her throat. Finally, she sank down into the chair by the wall and covered her face with her hands. "They want something," she murmured, her words muffled. Something I took. I thought it would end when I left India. I thought I could run away, but they found me. They always find me." The sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. Sundar crouched down in front of her, his eyes scanning her face for clues, his mind already racing through possibilities. She wasn't making sense yet, but her fear was real, palpable, and he knew it wasn't the kind of fear you could fake. "What did you take?" he asked, gently but insistently. "And who are they?" Her hands dropped from her face then, and her eyes glistened with tears. For a moment, she looked at him the way she used to, years ago, before everything between them broke. She opened her mouth to speak, but just then, the sound of glass breaking came again, louder this time. From the alley outside, Dot, without thinking, Sundar stood and moved toward the window. The curtains were thick, but he parted them just enough to see. Down below, in the narrow alleyway, the figure in the black hoodie was still there, standing perfectly still in the shadows. He wasn't running this time. He was looking up, directly at Sundar. Their eyes met, though Sundar couldn't make out the man's face in the darkness. Even from this distance, though, he felt a chill creep up his spine. The man didn't move. He just stood there, as if daring Sundar to come down. Dot behind him. Anita spoke again, her voice almost a hiss now. "Don't go down there." But Sundar had already made up his mind. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and glanced at her over his shoulder. "Lock the door after me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone but me." "You don't understand," she began, but he cut her off. "Then help me understand." "You said, but first, I need to know who that is." He didn't wait for her reply. He slipped out the front door, closing it behind him quietly so as not to draw attention. His footsteps echoed down the stairwell as he descended into the alley. The cold air outside bit at his skin, sharper now than before. The alley was darker than it had looked from the window, the tall walls of the buildings on either side closing. And like a trap, somewhere in the distance, a stray cat knocked over a trash can, the metallic crash echoing in the silence, and the figure in the black hoodie was still there, waiting. Sundar stopped a few feet away, keeping his voice calm though. His heart was hammering in his chest. Who are you? He demanded. What do you want from her? The figure tilted his head slightly, as though amused by the question. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. A flash of light caught it. A knife. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. But before he could react, the figure tossed the knife onto the ground at Sundar's feet. It clattered against the pavement and came to rest with its blade pointing toward him. Then the figure turned and began walking away. Disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the alley, Sundar stared after him for a long moment, trying to decide whether to follow. He glanced down at the knife. It was an ordinary kitchen knife, but attached to it was a slip of paper, folded and held in place with a rubber band. Asterisk. He crouched down and picked it up. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled in neat, careful handwriting. Bring it back by tomorrow midnight, or she disappears. His blood ran cold. He stuffed the note into his pocket and stood there, staring into the darkness where the man had vanished. Questions swirled in his mind. What did Anita take? Who were these people? And how far were they willing to go? He walked back to the apartment slowly, the weight of the note heavy in his pocket. When he reached her door, he knocked gently and whispered, "It's me." The door opened just a crack, and her eyes peered out at him. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. Anita was standing in the middle of the room now, her arms crossed over her chest, her body trembling slightly. He held up the knife and the note, and her face went pale. "What does this mean?" he asked quietly. "What are they talking about?" "What did you take?" She sank back down onto the chair, her shoulders slumping as though all the strength had drained out of her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "I only wanted to protect it. I didn't know they would follow me here." Sundar knelt in front of her again, his voice softer now. "Anita, listen to me. I can't help you unless you tell me the truth. What is it?" For a long time, she said nothing. Then, very slowly, she reached down and pulled a small leather pouch from her sweater pocket. Her fingers were shaking as she handed it to him. He took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a small metal key, old, tarnished, and strangely heavy in his palm. He looked up at her, confused. "A key?" She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "It unlocks something," she said. "Something they can never have. If they get it, it's over." He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could, a sudden crash came from the hallway outside. Loud, sharp, and unmistakable. The sound of someone kicking in the door to the building. Anita gasped and stood up. Sundar shoved the key into his pocket and moved toward the door, pressing his ear against it. Heavy footsteps were climbing the stairs fast, more than one person this time. He turned back to Anita. Her eyes met his, full of terror. "There's no time," she whispered. "You have to run." But before he could move, the doorknob rattled violently, and a voice from outside called out, low and cold, "We know you're in there. Open the door." Sundar backed away slowly, his mind racing, the weight of the key in his pocket like a stone. And then came a sound that made his heart stop. The sharp click of a gun being cocked just outside the door. Asterisk, the escapee sound of the gun being cocked was louder than anything Sundar had heard in years. It seemed to echo off the walls and press into his chest, freezing him in place. Outside the door, the footsteps stopped. For a brief, unbearable moment, there was only silence, broken by the shallow rhythm of Anita's breathing behind him. She was standing now, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes locked on the door as if she could hold it shut through sheer force of will. Then came the voice again. Low, cold, deliberate. "Last chance. Open the door, or we open it for you." Sundar's mind was racing. He glanced around the apartment, desperate for an idea. Any idea. There was no back door. The single bedroom window opened into the alley, 2 stories down, and the men outside sounded like they meant what they said. He could feel the weight of the key in his pocket, and now it felt heavier than ever, as though it carried more than just metal. It carried the choices he had made, the past he thought he left behind, the danger that now surrounded them. He took a deep breath and turned to Anita. "Window," he whispered. "Now." She hesitated for just a moment, her face pale, then nodded. Together they moved quickly to the bedroom. Behind them, the sound of a boot slamming into the front door cracked through the air. Once, twice. The wood began to splinter. Sundar yanked the curtains aside and shoved the window up. The cold night air rushed in, stinging his face. Below, the alley stretched out in darkness. It was a long drop, but at least it wasn't certain death. He swung one leg over the ledge and looked back at Anita. "Go," he said. She shook her head frantically. "You first?" she whispered. He didn't argue. He swung the other leg over and lowered himself as far as he could before letting go. He hit the ground hard, his knees buckling, but he managed to stay on his feet. Above him, Anita was already climbing through the window, her breath coming fast and uneven just as she began to lower herself down. The front door upstairs finally gave way with a deafening crash. The sound of footsteps thundered into the apartment. She froze for a second, but Sundar called up to her in a sharp whisper. "Anita, drop, now." She let go. He caught her awkwardly, and together they stumbled backward, landing in a heap on the cold pavement. Above them, voices shouted angrily, and a flashlight beam swept through the bedroom window. Sundar grabbed her hand and pulled her down the alley, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Somewhere behind them came the sharp sound of more boots pounding down the stairs, the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. He didn't look back. They ran through the maze of alleys, turning corner after corner, past dumpsters and chain-link fences, until finally they burst out onto a quiet residential street. Sundar's chest was burning, his breath coming in short, painful gasps, but he didn't stop. He kept her hand in his and kept moving, his mind focused on only one thought: put as much distance between them and those men as possible. At last, they ducked into a small park and sank onto a bench in the shadows of a tree. Both of them were gasping for air, their clothes damp with sweat despite the cold night air. Anita leaned forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Sundar watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice low but steady. "You're going to tell me everything now," he said. "No more riddles. No more running without answers. What is this key? Who are those men? And why did you call me?" She sat up slowly, her eyes red but resolute now. She took a long breath and began. "The key," she said softly, "unlocks a safe in Chennai. My father's safe. He wasn't who you thought he was. He worked for the government, yes, but not just as a clerk. He was a keeper. He was entrusted with documents, evidence, names, things people weren't supposed to know, things that could ruin powerful men." She paused and glanced around as though afraid someone might overhear. "When he died, they came for it," she continued. "But he had already given the key to me. He told me to hide it, to protect it no matter what. I ran. I left everything behind, and then I thought they'd forgotten about me. Until a week ago, when the first note appeared under my door." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. The handwriting matched the note from the knife. "You have one chance. Return the key, or pay the price." He stared at the note, his mind heavy with the weight of her words. It all began to make a grim kind of sense now. But there were still pieces missing, still things she wasn't telling him. "And me?" he asked after a moment. "Why call me after all these years?" Her gaze softened just a little, though her hand still trembled in her lap. "Because," she said quietly, "you're the only one I ever trusted, even after everything. Even after I broke your heart." For a moment, Sundar didn't know what to say. Her words cut deeper than he expected, and yet there was no time to dwell on them. Not now. He stood up, his mind already moving to the next step. "We can't stay here," he said. "They'll keep looking. We need to get somewhere safe. And then we need to decide what to do about that safe in Chennai." She nodded, though her face was pale just then. A noise behind them made both of them freeze. The faint crunch of gravel under a heavy boot. Sundar turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. At first he saw nothing. Then a figure stepped into the faint moonlight, and his breath caught in his throat that it wasn't the man in the black hoodie this time. This man was taller, older, wearing a dark suit that seemed oddly out of place in the park at this hour. His face was expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back. He simply stood there, watching them. "Give me the key," the man said calmly, his voice deep and almost polite. Sundar's fingers instinctively brushed the pocket where the key was hidden. The man's eyes followed the movement. "You don't know what you're holding," the man added. "You don't know what it's worth." Sundar stepped in front of Anita, his voice quiet but firm. "Then maybe you should tell me." The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. "You wouldn't believe me if I did," he said without warning. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something. Not a gun, but a small black device with a blinking red light. He pressed the button, and suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed all around them. More men, emerging from the trees on all sides, closing in silently. Anita let out a soft gasp behind him, and Sundar's heart began to pound. He grabbed her hand again and backed toward the edge of the park. But there was nowhere left to run. The man in the suit took a slow step forward. "Give me the key," he said again, "or neither of you leaves this park alive." And then, from somewhere behind them, a car engine roared to life, blinding headlights cutting through the darkness. A black sedan came skidding to a stop just a few feet away, its doors flying. "Open!" A voice from the car shouted, urgent and commanding. "Get in, now." Sundar didn't hesitate. He pulled Anita toward the car, shoving her inside before climbing in after her. The door slammed shut, and the car sped away, tires screeching against the pavement. Through the rear window, he caught one last glimpse of the man in the suit standing there under the moonlight, his face still calm, still smiling faintly, as though he already knew how this would end out inside the car. Sundar turned to the driver, a young woman with sharp eyes and a headset in her ear, and demanded, "Who are you?" She glanced at him in the mirror, her lips curling into the faintest smirk. "Let's just say," she said coolly, "I'm the only friend you've got left." And before he could ask another question, she pressed a button on the dashboard, and a hidden panel slid open to reveal a silver briefcase glowing faintly in the dim light. "Now," she said, her tone serious, "we need to talk about that key." The briefcase of the car sped through the sleeping streets, weaving between empty intersections and shadowed buildings, its tires whispering against the asphalt. Inside, the air was thick with the faint smell of leather and something metallic, something sharp that seemed to settle on the tongue. Sundar sat rigid in his seat, his fingers still clutching the edge of the door as he stared at the back of the driver's head. The young woman with the headset didn't speak right away. She drove with calm precision, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, where she studied him and Anita as if they were specimens under glass. Anita sat beside him, her body pressed into the corner of the seat, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was turned toward the window, but he could see the faint glimmer of tears tracking down her cheek, catching the glow of passing streetlights. The last 30 minutes had stripped what little color she had left from her face. Sundar cleared his throat quietly. "You said we need to talk about the key," he said, his voice low, controlled. "So, talk." The driver's eyes flicked to the mirror again, then back to the road. She didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke, her voice clipped and steady. "My name is Leela," she said. "I work for people who don't usually get involved in these things. But your ex-wife has made it impossible for us to stay out of it. And now, by answering her call tonight, so have you." Sundar's fingers curled into a fist in his lap. "Who are your people?" Leela let out the faintest of laughs, humorless, sharp. "Not the kind you'd invite for dinner," she said. "But better us than them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sundar glanced at Anita, but she avoided his eyes, her shoulders tense. He turned back to Leela, more impatient now. Why does everyone keep dancing around it? He asked, his voice rising slightly. What is this key? What does it unlock? What is everyone so afraid of? Without answering, Leela pressed another button on the dashboard. The silver briefcase on the seat beside her hissed softly, and the latch popped open. She slowed the car just enough to slide the briefcase toward him across the console. Open. She said. His hands hesitated over the lid for just a second. Then he flipped it open. Inside was a thick, padded folder, a flash drive sealed in a clear plastic bag, and a single photograph, yellowed at the edges, but the image sharp and chilling. It showed a group of men in suits standing in front of a small nondescript building. One of them, the man in the center, had his face scratched out in black ink. Sundar stared at the photograph for a long time. He didn't recognize the building, but the suits, the way they stood, the scratch over the man's face, it all radiated menace. What is this? He asked, almost in a whisper. Leela answered without looking at him. The building you see in that photo is in Chennai, she said. Behind that door are records, lists, names, things that were never meant to see the light of day. The man with the blacked out face, he was the keeper before your ex-wife's father. He disappeared 2 weeks after that photograph was taken. His body was never found. Sundar felt a chill run through him. He turned to Anita, but she still stared out the window, her reflection faint and ghostly in the glass. Why her father? He asked. Leela gave a dry little smile, her eyes still fixed on the road. Because he was the only one willing to say no, she said simply, for a long time. Sundar sat in silence, staring down at the photograph, the key in his pocket suddenly feeling like it was burning against his skin. So these records, he began slowly. If they fall into the wrong hands, they already have. Leela cut him off. At least parts of them, but not all. What's left is in that building, and the key your ex-wife carries is the only way in. Anita flinched slightly when Leela said your ex-wife, but still didn't speak. Sundar stared at her now, a quiet storm gathering behind his eyes. You should have told me, he said, his voice low but steady. She finally turned to face him then, and the look on her face made his heart ache, despite his anger. Equal parts shame, fear, and something else he couldn't name. I didn't want to drag you into this. She whispered, you built a life. You became someone they couldn't touch. I thought if I stayed away. She trailed off. He shook his head slowly, unable to hide the bitter edge in his voice. And how did that work out? The car swerved sharply as Leela turned down unmarked road, pulling into what looked like an underground parking garage. The gate slid shut behind them with a heavy clank. The lights overhead buzzed faintly as the car rolled to a stop in front of a steel door. We don't have much time, Leela said briskly, shutting off the engine and stepping out. They'll have tracked you here already, but we can at least buy you a few hours to decide what comes next. Sundar climbed out of the car slowly, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. He helped Anita out, and together they followed Leela through the steel door, down a narrow hallway, lined with flickering fluorescent lights. At the end of the hall was a small room, bare except for a table, 3 chairs and another briefcase, resting on the tabletop. Leela motioned for them to sit. You have 2 choices, she said once they were seated. Hand over the key to us, and we make sure it disappears where no one, not them, not even you, can ever find it. Or you take it back to Chennai yourself, unlock that door, and burn whatever is inside before they can get to it. Either way, you won't walk away from this untouched. Sundar exchanged a long look with Anita. He could see the question in her eyes, the same question that burned in his own chest. Did they still have it in them to fight this? To face what waited at the end of this path? And if we do nothing? He asked finally, his voice quiet. Leela leaned forward slightly, her expression sharp and merciless now. If you do nothing, she said, she dies. And they come for you next. A thick silence fell over the room then, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. Sundar stared down at the key in his hand, feeling its jagged edges press into his palm, just as he opened his mouth to speak. The lights above flickered once, then went out completely, Plunging the room into darkness. Leeel swore under her breath, fumbling for something in her pocket. Sundar reached instinctively for Anita's hand, feeling her fingers clutch his like a lifeline. Then, from somewhere beyond the door, came the unmistakable sound of a gunshot and another, closer this time. Leela hissed, her voice low but urgent. Now, they're here? She yanked the briefcase off the table, snapped it shut, and slung it under her arm. She pulled a small pistol from her jacket and motioned toward the back of the room. There's a service tunnel, she said. Go. Now. But as they turned toward the tunnel door, it swung open from the other side, and in the faint light spilling in from the hallway, Sundar saw him. The man in the black. Odie. He stood in the doorway, his face still hidden in shadow, his hands empty this time. But the smile that spread slowly across his face made Sundar's blood run cold. You really thought you could outrun us? The man said, his voice soft and mocking. And before Sundar could react, the man reached into his hoodie, pulled out something metallic, and threw it onto the floor. Between them, it landed with a dull thud and began to beep softly. Sundar stared down at it, his chest tightening with realization. A small black device. A timer. Counting down from 30 seconds. Asterisk, the countdown's beeping was soft at first, almost harmless, but in the heavy silence of that small room, it felt deafening, sharp, and final, like a heartbeat ticking its way toward death. 30 seconds. That was all the black device promised them, its red numbers flashing relentlessly on the cold cement floor. Sundar's body reacted before his mind did. He lunged forward, grabbing Anita by the wrist, pulling her away from the table as the man in the hoodie stood calmly in the doorway, watching with the faintest trace of amusement on his lips. Leela reacted too, though differently. She stayed low, her pistol already drawn, her free hand snatching the silver briefcase off the table. She kicked her chair aside and barked in a voice so sharp it cut through the panic rising in Sundar's chest. Out, now, don't stop for anything. Asterisk, she moved toward the back of the room, toward the narrow service tunnel she had pointed out before. Sundar half-dragged Anita with him, his mind a tangle of instinct and terror. But even as they reached the threshold, he couldn't help but glance back. Asterisk. The man in the hoodie hadn't moved. He stood in the doorway, dark and still, his hands in his pockets, his head slightly tilted as though he were curious to see what they would do. And just before Sundar slipped into the tunnel, the man called out, soft but clear enough to chill him to the bone. You can run, he said, but you won't get far. Then the lights flickered violently. The beeping grew faster, and Leela shoved him hard into the darkness of the tunnel. They ran. The narrow passage was lit only by faint emergency strips that painted everything in a ghostly glow. Their footsteps thundered off the concrete walls, each breath coming ragged, burning in Sundar's chest. He could still hear the beeping behind them, growing faster, counting down mercilessly. 20 seconds. The tunnel bent sharply, and the faint whiff of cold night air met them. Leela was ahead now, her gun in one hand, the briefcase clutched in the other, moving like someone who had done this before. Sundar kept pace behind her, his grip on Anita's wrist so tight he worried he might hurt her, but she didn't protest. She was silent now, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked ahead. 15 seconds. They burst through a metal door at the end of the tunnel, into another part of the underground garage, empty this time, quiet except for the faint echo of the city beyond. They didn't stop. Leela led them to a stairwell and motioned up. Roof, she hissed. They climbed fast, 2 steps at a time, the sound of their own breathing louder now than anything else. Sundar's legs burned, but he didn't dare slow down, not with the memory of those red numbers still flashing in his mind. 10 seconds. At the top of the stairs, another door. Leela slammed it open, and the cold night wind rushed over them in a sudden wave. They stumbled onto the roof, a flat expanse of gravel and steel, surrounded by the glittering skyline of the city beyond. Sundar doubled over, gasping for breath, but Leela didn't pause. She scanned the rooftop, her sharp eyes finding what she was looking for. A black helicopter sat at the far end of the roof, its rotors already spinning lazily. Two figures stood by it, armed and waiting, their expressions unreadable in the dark. 5 seconds dot behind them, from deep within the building. The faint sound of shouting, and then a deep, shuddering roar as the explosion tore through the underground. Below, the blast shook the roof, sending a wave of heat and dust up through the stairwell. Sundar instinctively threw himself over Anita, shielding her from the wind and grit, his ears ringing with the force of it. When he finally lifted his head, the stairwell door behind them was hanging off its hinges, thick smoke billowing out. Leela. She grabbed Sundar by the arm, dragging him toward the helicopter. "We're not done yet," she snapped. They reached the aircraft and were ushered inside quickly. The rotors roared to life, the deafening thrum drowning out every other sound. As they lifted into the night sky, Sundar sank into the seat, still holding Anita's hand, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Below them, the building shrank into a plume of black smoke and orange flame. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady chop of the blades and the rush of wind around them. Sundar stared at Anita, searching her face for something. Anger, fear, regret, but she only stared out the window. Her expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to Leela, who sat opposite him, her pistol resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the briefcase. "Where are you taking us?" he asked. She glanced up at him, her mouth a thin line. "Somewhere safe," she said. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Safe? There's no such place anymore, is there?" To his surprise, she almost smiled at that. "Not really," she admitted, "but safer than here, for now." Anita finally spoke then, her voice quiet but firm. "Where is it?" Leela arched an eyebrow. "Where is what?" "The building," Anita pressed. "The one in Chennai?" "The one my father protected." "Where is it?" Leela leaned back slightly, studying her. After a moment, she opened the briefcase just enough to slide out the photograph, though one of the scratched-out man standing in front of that nondescript building. She handed it to Anita without a word. Anita held it in her hands for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the faded paper. She looked up at Sundar, her eyes wet but steady now. "If we don't end this there," she said softly, "it will never stop." Sundar swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He reached over and took her hand again, squeezing it gently. Leela watched them silently for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded map. She handed it to Sundar. "You'll need this," she said simply. He opened the map, his eyes scanning the thin red line that led through the heart of Chennai to a small circle marked deep within the city. The street names were familiar, but blurred now, seen through a haze of memory and fear. "How long?" he asked. "If we make it through the night," Leela replied, "we can be there in 36 hours. The helicopter dipped slightly, banking eastward, and the lights of the city below gave way to dark fields and rivers winding silently in the moonlight. Sundar leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment, feeling the exhaustion seep into his bones. But even with his eyes shut, he could still see the man in the hoodie, the way he stood in that doorway, calm and unhurried, his words echoing in Sundar's mind. "You can run, but you won't get far." And as if to prove the point, the pilot's voice crackled over the headset suddenly, tense, urgent. "We got company." Sundar opened his eyes and looked out the window. In the distance, another aircraft was closing in, dark and sleek, its lights off, but unmistakable against the stars. Leela cursed under her breath, gripping the edge of her seat. She turned to Sundar and Anita, her expression sharper now. "Colder. Buckle in," she said. "This is about to get messy." Below them, the world tilted sharply as the helicopter banked hard. The chase already underway. Asterisk the last door. Helicopter banked hard to the right, throwing Sundar against his harness as the dark aircraft behind them closed the distance. Its engines roared through the night sky, a low, predatory hum that seemed to crawl under his skin. Lights still off, it felt more like a shadow than a machine. A shadow with sharp claws reaching for them. Leela was already on her feet, bracing herself against the wall, barking quick instructions into her headset. Her face, usually so controlled, was tight now with urgency, her knuckles white as she gripped her pistol. Sundar could see in her eyes what she wasn't saying. This wasn't a chase they were meant to win. The pilot shouted something over the comms, and the helicopter lurched again, diving lower toward the black fields below. Sundar caught a glimpse of rivers glinting faintly in the moonlight, narrow roads cutting through scattered lights of sleeping villages. Anita's hand clutched his tightly, so tight it hurt, but he didn't let go. Not now. A sudden flash lit the sky behind them, bright and sharp, and then an explosion rattled the cabin. Smoke curled outside the window, one of the rotor blades whining louder than before. Sundar's stomach dropped as the helicopter began to wobble. The pilot, fighting to keep it steady, Leela slammed her palm against the side of the cabin and shouted, her voice cutting through the roar. "We can't make Chennai in this," she yelled. "We have to set down. We'll go the rest of the way on foot." The pilot pulled hard on the controls, aiming for a stretch of darkened road below. The helicopter groaned, shuddering violently, but somehow it held together long enough to land hard on the tarmac. The impact rattled through Sundar's bones. But the moment they stopped moving, Leela was already throwing the door open and waving them out. "Move," she ordered. "They won't wait." The three of them ran, ducking into the cover of tall grass by the roadside as the enemy aircraft circled overhead, searchlights sweeping the ground. The night was alive now with the sound of engines and boots, men shouting commands in the distance. But Leela seemed to know exactly where to go, guiding them silently through the fields. Her movements quick and sure. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Chennai. The air was thick and warm now, the streets already waking with the sounds of the city, horns blaring, vendors calling, bicycles weaving through narrow lanes. Sundar's chest ached with exhaustion, his shirt clinging to him with sweat, but the sight of the familiar streets filled him with something he couldn't quite name. Memory, maybe, grief, a strange kind of hope. Leela led them through winding alleys and quiet back streets until they stopped in front of an unremarkable building wedged between two shops, its faded shutters drawn, its paint peeling. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But when Anita saw it, she froze, her breath catching. "This is it," she whispered. Leela glanced at Sundar. "You had the key?" He nodded, feeling its weight in his pocket. As he stepped toward the door, his hand shook, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that whatever lay on the other side would change everything. The lock was old and rusted, but the key slid in smoothly, as though it had been waiting all these years. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a dark stairway descending into silence. They stepped inside. The air was cooler here, heavy with dust and the faint scent of old paper. Leela closed the door behind them, plunging the stairwell into shadow before switching on a dim flashlight.